Hello, I'm Luke Holmes from the University of Essex, and today I'm going to present my research on pupil dilation to explicit and non-explicit sexual stimuli. When we're assessing sexual arousal, it would be ideal if we could rely on self-reports and simply ask the participant how arousing they found a sexual stimulus. Unfortunately, that's not viable, as these self-reports are often unreliable for various different reasons. The most common alternative used is the measurement of genital arousal, and that can be done in a few different ways, but they all tend to indicate the same underlying trends. This includes sex differences, so the vast majority of men are sexually aroused exclusively by their preferred sex. Women, on the other hand, tend to display what we'd call a bisexual arousal pattern, equal arousal to both sexes, even if they're heterosexual. This alone suggests that there's a difference between men and women that isn't reflected in self-reports. Also notable are the differences between sexual orientations. Lesbians, for example, don't follow the same pattern most other women do. Although they do show some arousal to both sexes, they tend to show, on average, more arousal to their preferred sex. These trends highlight the need for objective measures of sexual arousal. However, genital arousal measurement has to be used with care. Only certain people are willing to volunteer for studies which involve it. Men in general are far more willing to volunteer than women are, for example. So, studies which use genital arousal measures might be opening themselves up to volunteer bias, and that might result in skewed findings, especially across different cultures. Because of this, it makes sense to investigate other objective measures of sexual arousal, in particular those which are less invasive and would hopefully attract a wider range of participants to our studies. So, the measure we're focusing on is pupil dilation. Pupil dilation is an automatic response, and it reflects activation of the autonomic nervous system. It's completely out of the control of the participant. It's highly responsive, and a typical pupillary response occurs within just a few seconds of the stimulus being displayed. It's been found that pupils dilate more to explicit stimuli featuring your preferred sex than your non-preferred sex, and it appears that pupil dilation in response to preferred explicit sexual stimuli may be the strongest pupillary response which exists. It's also linked to genital arousal, with the link between pupil dilation, genital arousal, and sexual orientation being found in both sexes, but especially strongly in men. Another problem we face when we're running these kinds of studies is that even when we remove the genital arousal components, the displaying of explicit sexual stimuli is still invasive in itself. As such, if we were to find pupil dilation differences in response to non-explicit sexual stimuli as well, we could potentially test participants who are not only uncomfortable with their genital arousal being measured, but also those who are uncomfortable with watching explicit sexual stimuli. Another big benefit to the use of pupil dilation is that it provides the same measure for both males and females, which is a problem with genital arousal measures because of the different methods of measurement between sexes. Pupil dilation, therefore, is directly comparable between sexes in a way that genital arousal measures might not be. The way that we tested this was by recruiting 165 men and 160 women who were distributed across the Kinsey scale, ranging from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. We showed them 24 explicit sexual video stimuli featuring people masturbating, and also 24 non-explicit sexual video stimuli featuring attractive clothed men and women talking about the weather. In addition to this, we showed them 2 neutral stimuli of landscapes. In order to gather data on viewing time as well as pupil dilation, the experiment was split into 2 parts. The first part consisted of just 1 sexual stimulus on the screen, and the second displayed 2 at once side by side. An example of this is going to be shown a little bit later on. In order to measure pupil dilation, we use an eye tracker. For those of you who aren't familiar with eye tracking, I'm just going to briefly explain how that works. This is the specific machine we use to measure it. It's an iLink 1000. It has a component which projects near-infrared light and a lens to pick up its reflection, and usually this is used to track where a person is looking on a screen. In our case though, we're able to measure the size of the pupil very precisely in pixels. This device is able to sample 1,000 times a second, and that means that even very tiny changes in pupil dilation occurring over a very short time are recorded in the data. The screen at the bottom is an example of the kind of thing we see on the computer. So moving on to our predictions, the first prediction was that pupil dilation to non-explicit stimuli will relate to pupil dilation to the corresponding explicit stimuli. In other words, if a participant dilates more to explicit sexual stimuli featuring males, regardless of the sex of the participant, they should dilate more to non-explicit stimuli featuring males as well. The same, of course, is true for participants who dilate more to stimuli featuring females. And here are the results for prediction 1. We found small to modest correlations between pupil dilation to explicit and non-explicit sexual stimuli. In other words, it seems that there is a link between dilation to explicit and non-explicit sexual stimuli, and it's therefore possible that they are related in a similar way to sexual orientation. Our second prediction is that the link found between pupil dilation and self-reported sexual orientation will be stronger in men than it will in women for both explicit and non-explicit sexual stimuli. This is in line with previous research, which has found a stronger link between sexual orientation and dilation to explicit stimuli in men, and that's a trend that's also been found in research on genital arousal. For prediction 2, we calculated contrast scores for pupil dilation. To do this, we took a participant's dilation to the same sex, and we deducted from that their dilation to the other sex. Simply put, if they dilate more to the same sex, they end up with a positive score, and if they prefer the other sex, then they end up with a negative score. The centre line on both graphs is a line of best fit for the trends, that's the solid one, and the dotted lines above and below it are the 95% confidence intervals. As you can see, we have 0 in the middle of the y-axis, with negative numbers below it and positive numbers above it. Along the x-axis, we have the participant scores on the Kinsey scale. Exclusively heterosexual people are towards the left of the graph, they're 0, and exclusively homosexual people are towards the right of the graph, with bisexual people in the middle. These are the graphs for explicit stimuli. The general trend is what you'd probably expect. People who are straight tend to dilate more to the other sex, resulting in a negative score, and people who are gay tend to dilate more to the same sex, resulting in a positive score, with bisexual individuals somewhere in the middle. This was true for both sexes, but the relationship was stronger in men than women, and straight women in particular tend to have an average pupil dilation very close to 0, indicating almost identical dilation to both sexes, but with a very slight preference for males. Here are the same graphs for the non-explicit stimuli, once again with the line of best fit and the confidence intervals displayed. Here we see two very similar trends to the last slide, although for both sexes the relationship between sexual orientation and pupil dilation is weaker for non-explicit stimuli than it was for the explicit stimuli. The linear relationship between the two, however, is still highly significant for both sexes. Once again we see the same trend in women, with straight women showing almost equal dilation to both sexes. For men, the line is far less steep, which indicates less dilation to their preferred sex on both ends of the Kinsey scale. Our third prediction is that concordance between pupil dilation, viewing time, and self-reported attraction will be stronger in men overall than it is in women. Prediction 3 is something assessed in the second part of the experiment. As you can see here, this part involves participants being shown pairs of explicit or non-explicit stimuli side by side. We gathered data on which one they spent the most time looking at. The white dot represents where the participant is looking at any given time. As mentioned before, this has been found previously to correlate positively with genital arousal. So, in order to test our hypothesis, we checked the correlation between pupil dilation, viewing time, and self-reported attraction for each sex. What we found was that for explicit stimuli, the correlations were modest to strong, with an average absolute correlation, the average of all the correlations, being 0.64 for men and 0.53 for women. The correlations and the sex difference between them were found to be significant. For non-explicit sexual stimuli, the correlations were reduced but were still significant, 0.47 for men and 0.41 for women. Again, the sex difference between them was smaller, but it was still significant. Our fourth and final prediction is that the link between pupil dilation, sexual orientation, viewing time, and self-reported attraction will be stronger in explicit stimuli than non-explicit stimuli. This is simply because explicit sexual stimuli is more sexually arousing than non-explicit stimuli, and so any effect produced by it should be magnified in explicit stimuli. In order to test this hypothesis, we checked the degree of correlation between these factors separately for both men and women. The difference was found for men, but it fell short of significance in women. One possible explanation for this is the fact that heterosexual women have a tendency to dilate to both sexes, which might damage the relationship between sexual orientation and pupil dilation in women. Additionally, across all participants as a group, dilation was found to be significantly stronger to the same sex than the other sex when it came to explicit stimuli. So what does this mean for the field? Well, pupil dilation to non-explicit sexual stimuli does appear to be linked to dilation to explicit sexual stimuli, although in some cases, and especially in women, the links can be relatively weak. However, since they are related, if we could combine pupil dilation with other less invasive measures of sexual arousal, it's possible that we could construct an experimental paradigm which doesn't require invasive measurement techniques in order to provide a reasonable degree of certainty of how aroused a participant is in response to a stimulus. In addition to this, our results suggest that we may be able to use non-explicit sexual stimuli in place of the normal explicit stimuli and still elicit a similar response. These two factors taken in combination could potentially open sexual arousal studies to a far wider range of potential participants and improve the universality of our findings, especially across different cultures. Thanks for listening.